Welcome back to Preservation Travels with Lane and Kevin. Today I am in Covington, Louisiana.
There are houses that feel like a single moment in time, perfectly frozen. And then there are houses like this one, where the story is layered, rewritten, and still legible if you know where to look. We're in Covington, Louisiana, on a lush bend in the river. This site has gone by many names over more than a century. The campgrounds, Ravenswood, the Grant Place, the Weaver Place, Hotel Richard, and the Riverside Inn. Names change when a place changes function. When a private home becomes a boarding house, when a riverside tract becomes a destination, when a quiet retreat becomes part of a town's identity. Today, we're going to walk through the history and architecture of this property from the earliest land grants to the early 20th century. And we're going to pay attention to what the building itself tells us. Because even when the records are incomplete, old houses keep their own receipts. Architecturally, early images of the house show Italianate touches. Look at the cornice treatment and the brackets, those crisp, rhythmic elements that hint at a mid-19th century taste for the picturesque, romantic forms. Italianate in Louisiana often blends with local building traditions, and what you get is not pure textbook style, but a regional expression of a broader American aesthetic. At the time, this facade had been modified. Columns had been removed and relocated to side elevations. They were lengthened, and the dramatic central bay entrances on both levels appear to date from a later remodeling. That's not unusual. It's actually part of the house's story. Houses change when their uses change. And this property changed use repeatedly. A building like this is a living document. This story begins in 1803 when a Creole planter named Jacques Drew acquired a large river-fronting tract as a Spanish colonial grant. The grant was expansive, with substantial river frontage and deep acreage behind it. This was the era of shifting empires and shifting maps. This region had been part of British West Florida until it was ceded to Spain, and the Louisiana Purchase was unfolding in the same season of history. Drew's acquisition appears to have been speculative or agricultural, or both. Like so many early landowners, he saw opportunity across the lake from New Orleans in the timber, the clay, and in the promise of development. After Drew, ownership moved through a series of men whose lives mirrored the economic engine of the North Shore itself. John Wharton Collins bought the land in 1813. Collins is not just a name on the deed book. He is woven into the origin story of Covington. He divided lands into squares and lots, pushing the area toward town form rather than wilderness tract. He called his development Wharton, dedicated to Thomas Jefferson, and later watched the legislature rename it Covington over his protest. Even in naming, you can feel the tension between private ambition and public identity. Then came Thomas Tate, who arrived in Louisiana by the flatboat route down the Ohio and Mississippi, the kind of migration story that built much of the early 19th century landscape of America. Not every owner left behind grand architectural evidence, but each owner left behind context. Then came Judge Jesse Rubel Jones, a jurist and a manufacturer with a brickyard on the river and a lumber operation feeding a booming market across the lake in New Orleans. Covington's 19th century prosperity was tied to building materials, and it was water transport that made those materials move. Clay became brick, pine became timber, and the river became a corridor. In the mid-19th century, the storyline shifts again toward the people who lived on the water for a living: steamboat captains, mail routes, lake traffic. By the 1840s, the North Shore had gained a reputation for healthy air and mineral springs. For New Orleanians, it offered a retreat from summer disease and the seasonal threat of yellow fever. Covington and the surrounding river landscape became not just a working corridor, but a refuge, a place to breathe. And this particular site seems to have become known as the campgrounds. That name is telling. In the 1840s, Methodist camp meetings were a real cultural phenomenon. Large gatherings in wooded settings, temporary structures, preaching, prayer, and crowds that can number in the hundreds or more. Contemporary descriptions of a campground near Covington speak of pine bluffs, a clear river, an open-air worship structure, and people arriving by steamers from New Orleans. Then, in 1850, the land was purchased by William Thomas Hepp and Captain John William Hoffman. Hepp was connected to New Orleans commerce, including the import trade of brandies and wines. Hoffman was a lake captain running steamboat routes that carried people to the North Shore resorts. It's not difficult to imagine the plan: a financier and a captain pairing capital with transportation. The idea of an inn or a destination along the river makes perfect sense in this era, although there's no real evidence that they built the house as we see it today. Now, we arrive at the architectural heart of the story, and here is the honest truth. Despite extensive research, there's no definitive documentation for the exact date of construction, nor the architect or the builder. That happens more often than people think, especially in places where map surveys and parish records don't always survive or were never deposited in the first place. But evidence suggests that the house was built in 1860, and the most compelling argument is simple. The paper trail does not mention a building on this track until 1860. Then suddenly, it does. In March of 1860, Hepp sold the tract to Captain John Grant, a steamboat captain and engineer with an impressive record. Grant had worked on major engineering and dredging projects, held patents, and was associated with transportation infrastructure in New Orleans and Mobile. He also operated mail routes. This was a man whose life was built around water, movement, and mechanics. The property, after his purchase, becomes connected to a house name that feels straight out of Victorian literature: Ravenswood. In October of 1860, Grant leased the house, now identified by name, to Lucy Ann Dorfley, who would operate it as a boarding house. That lease is significant because it's the first clear reference to a building on this site. It also establishes the pattern that will continue for decades. This is a home, yes, but it's also a place that receives people, a house that becomes an inn, a private residence that doubles as a public refuge. Now, the Civil War era adds another layer to the Grant story. There's a legend that General Benjamin Butler used this house as a summer retreat during his occupation of New Orleans. Research doesn't support this claim in a definitive way. Butler's own accounts do not place him here, and the local press is censored during the occupation, which complicates the record. But what is documented, and arguably more interesting, is Captain John Grant's own position during the war. Grant was described as a Union sympathizer. His boats were seized by the Confederate government early in the conflict. He spent long periods of time farming his place near Covington rather than operating his vessels. He was taken from bed at midnight and held as a prisoner of war for weeks. He traveled very little. His property was occupied at times. Horses were impressed. Officers appeared. The war arrived on his doorstep, as it did for so many. If you want a historic house story that's tidy, you'll be disappointed. Real history is messier and much more human. What matters is that this house stood through it, and the paper trail captures glimpses of the lives lived inside. After the war, activity on the lake and river continued. There are even engineering reports discussing obstructions in the river, sunken steamers, dredging estimates, and the infrastructure required to keep Covington connected by water. This matters because the life of this house is tied to water routes, to mail routes, to freight lines, to the mechanics of moving people and goods. This is not scenery. It's an economic lifeline. And then, By 1885, the property changes hands again. Captain Henry Thomas Grace Weaver purchases it and names the place Weaver Place. This begins to appear in maps and local references. Weaver, like Grant and Hoffman, is another figure in the lake trade, running routes between New Orleans and Covington. The Weavers' family ownership spans the late 19th and early 20th century, and during those decades, the property becomes repeatedly associated with hospitality. This is where architecture and function become almost inseparable. A private home can be intimate, an inn can be welcoming. An inn needs circulation. It needs rooms that can be used flexibly. It needs arrivals and departures to feel natural. Even the floor plan has been altered. You can often sense when a house was designed or adapted to receive strangers. The Riverside Inn appears in early 20th century references as a beautiful hotel spot in this section, and it is described in ways that place it among Covington's broader cultural resort. Boarding houses, cottages, and inns that offered rest, pine air, and a change of pace from New Orleans. Covington's identity as a retreat town is now part of this house's identity. And the names keep rolling like the river itself. In 1912, Captain Weaver transferred the property to his daughter, Rebecca Pauline Weaver Barringer. The house continues its life as a residence and as a boarding house. A lease records the continuity of its hospitality use. Then, in 1920, the Weavers family long ownership ends when the property is sold to Blanche and Eugene Richard. The days of the boarding house or inn seem to close around this time or soon thereafter, and the property becomes a vacation home rather than a public retreat. In 1929, it's purchased by New Orleans attorney Robert C. Milling as a summer retreat for his family. This house is a mid-19th century riverside residence with Italianate influence, later modified and repeatedly adapted for hospitality. It sits on land that was shaped by colonial grants, early development speculation, the brick and timber industry, and the transportation network that stitched the North Shore to New Orleans. It's also a house where documentary certainty does not exist in every corner. No definitive architect, no single construction document with a neat date. But the absence of certainty doesn't erase the presence of evidence. Early images show a particular cornice language. Later changes are visible in the façade. Ownership records align with shifts in use, and the names themselves reveal the social life of the property. Campgrounds suggest gathering. Ravenswood suggests Victorian romanticism. And the Riverside Inn suggests leisure and seasonal migration. This is what makes historic houses compelling. Not that they're perfect, not that they're pure, but that they're readable. If you're restoring a house like this, the lesson is not to chase an imagined original state as if time can be reversed. The lesson is to understand what is original, what is altered, and what is significant in every layer. You preserve the elements that carry the identity forward. You respect the evidence. You avoid the temptation to flatten a complex house into a single era because that era feels the most marketable or most romantic. This barn did not begin its life here. It was originally built in Ontario, Canada, part of an agricultural landscape shaped by timber framing traditions that valued strength, repairability, and longevity over speed. Like many barns of its era, it was designed to work hard, to shelter animals and harvests, and to stand through generations of use. When its original life came to an end, the barn was not demolished. It was carefully dismantled, timber by timber, each piece labeled and preserved. Those timbers traveled hundreds of miles south, crossing borders and landscapes before arriving here in Covington. What you see now is not a replica and not a simple relocation. It's a reassembly and a reimagining. These beams were hand-joined, without modern fasteners, and designed to be taken apart and put back together again. That adaptability is part of what makes early timber framing so enduring. These structures were never meant to be disposable. Here, the barn has been given a new purpose while retaining its original logic. The proportions still speak to agricultural scale. The joinery still tells the story of how it was made. You can read the history in the wear patterns, the tool marks, and the way the timbers meet. This is preservation through continuation. Rather than freezing the barn in time, it's been allowed to evolve, much as the main house has. It stands as a reminder that historic structures do not need to be trapped in their original use to remain authentic. They need to be understood, respected, and thoughtfully adapted. In a way, the barn belongs here, not because it started here, but because it's been allowed to keep being what it was always meant to be: useful, honest, and built to last. This house has already lived multiple lives. It can live another without losing itself. Standing here, it's easy to understand why people came. The air, the water, the shade, the sense that time slows on the North Shore. People cross the lake seeking relief from summer sickness and city heat. They came to Pine Bluffs and clear water. They came to boarding houses and veranda. They came to places like this, where hospitality was built into the architecture. And now, we get to be the ones who notice, the ones who look past the listing language and hear the deeper story. A property shaped by river commerce, resort culture, and the long, patient endurance of an old house doing what old houses do best: remembering.
Thank you for joining us for another Preservation Travels with Lane and Kevin. Just a reminder, we are not realtors. We do not represent this house or guarantee this house in any way. If you think you should be the next steward of this amazing home, the link is in the description below. Give the realtor a call and come see this amazing house.